Hello, everyone, wherever you are out there in the world. Welcome very much to our panel. My name is Nikki Dryden. I'm a two-time Olympic swimmer, human rights lawyer, athlete, activist, and a board member here at the Center for Sport and Human Rights. So I spent the last 30 years of my life as an elite athlete, journalist, and now athlete activist. And so it is a great privilege to be able to moderate this panel today with my fellow athletes. So first of all, a big welcome to the Sporting Chance Forum 2021, coming to you live, but in the universe out there in the internet, brought to you by the Center for Sport and Human Rights. So please follow us online at sporthumanrights.org, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, we are at Sport and Rights. And don't forget, as you're watching us today, please use the hashtag SCF21. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet. For me, I come to you all from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, Australia, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So now I would like to introduce my fellow athletes and our panelists today. We have Chelsey Gotell, who's the chairperson of the IPC, that's the International Paralympic Committee Athletes Council. She's also a Paralympian and a fellow Canadian swimmer. So I don't know how we both ended up on a panel together, but it's the swimming gods are shining down on us today. So welcome, Chelsey. We also have a Gabby Garton, who is the Player Relations Coordinator of the World Players Association, a member of FIFPro's Global Player Council. She herself is an international professional football player for Argentina. She also plays for my rival club here in Australia, which I'm not too happy about. We won't talk about that. And also an academic. Welcome, Gabby. And then we have Brendan Williams, a high jumper, my other favorite sport. This is like a panel full of my favorite sports. So Brendan is a high jumper from the Dominica. He's the chair of the Athletes Advisory Commission at the Commonwealth Games Federation. So welcome to all of you. I'm so excited to be here with you, my fellow people. Everybody, the chat function works. Please use it today. Your questions will come in, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for audience questions. So please feel free to use that. So today we're talking about freedom of expression and athlete activism. And as an activist myself, the fact that athlete activism on the rise is certainly a positive step. I remember being at conferences like this 15 years ago and being the only athlete. So it's so great to be able to facilitate the voice of these incredible athlete activists and representatives that we have today. Freedom of expression is also dear to my heart because without the ability to speak out and act freely on topics that are of concern to us, athletes are impeded from realizing other human rights. And freedom of expression in that sense is an enabling right. It provides space for other rights to be realized. Of course, all speech is not free. The right is defined in international law. Speech that incites violence or hatred, in particular of minorities, is not free. At the same time, it's really important that this right affords all individuals the ability to express their views openly and in a forum of their choosing. So the center is a special place. The Center for Sport and Human Rights builds and promotes safe spaces that nurture conversations and dialogue. We are respectful and inclusive, and we want to engage diverse views of different affected groups and stakeholders and be a catalyst for cultivating collective action. And so I hope that we will all think of those things in spirit today as we talk about, what is a very hot topic, but also sensitive, and there's going to be different views that we're going to discuss today. So turning to the athletes, I really want to hear from all of you about your experiences in the area of athlete freedom of expression. There's been so much going on this topic over the last 2 years. And so we'll start with Chelsey. As the chairperson of the IPC Athletes Council, my understanding is that you guys have spent the last couple of years actually in a consultation process working on how athletes can express themselves at the Paralympics. So can you talk us through how that process unfolded? How did you conduct it? And what recommendations actually were made?
Absolutely. Thanks, Nikki. Nikki. Yeah, we've been in a consultation. Well, we finished the consultation in June of this year. It started about last July, August, and came out of course, the very important discussion going on that started with really Black Lives Matter in the US with, the murder of George Floyd. It really sparked the conversation within the Paralympic movement about athletes having voices on important issues. And it raised the question to us about what does this mean for the Paralympic Games and how do we want to address this for the future to allow our athletes to have more of a voice while also respecting athletes who choose not to have a voice. And being a global organization, really looking at the full landscape of what it means to have a voice. In Canada, for me, I'm very free to say whatever I want and I have a platform, but, some of our other athletes from different nations may not have that ability to do so. So at the Paralympic Games, to have a voice may mean that everybody can say whatever they want, but what does that mean when they go home to their home nations? Will they be persecuted? Will there be some sort of fine put on them? And then we can't protect them there. So how do we look globally through our consultation to ensure that athletes around the world are heard, that we're opening up new opportunities to allow them to have a voice, while also respecting the athletes that would choose not to have a voice at the games or for fear of being forced to have a voice? So what we did was we launched a consultation. There was 2 different phases to the consultation. It was open to every single para athlete in the world. I am disappointed in the number of athletes who chose to engage or maybe chose not to engage in the consultation, since it was open to all. And we did promote it quite heavily through social media and through athlete representatives around the world and online in every way we possibly could. But we did both focus groups where we brought athletes through various focus groups. They could sign up to join a focus group and have a 3-hour discussion about athlete expression. That discussion, the first big thing that we knew we had to do was first educate athletes about what our current rules are. It's hard to have a meaningful discussion if an athlete is coming in not fully understanding the whole picture of what we currently have in place and why it's there, so that their feedback is then informed. So we spent the first 30 minutes of the session, maybe 45 minutes, talking about why the rule's in place, what it means, what the current gaps of the rule that we had were, and that kind of information. And then it was just an open conversation. There was no IPC staff involved. It was just the Athletes Council with athletes, having an open dialogue, hearing all the different conversations and the different views from the spectrum of athletes. From one end, from athletes saying, we want the rule abolished, we would like to be able to say whatever we want, to the other end, where athletes are saying, absolutely not, the rule needs to be in place. I don't want to ever be in the position to have to either stand beside somebody who's making a political statement and taking away, the podium from me, who's earned my spot on the top of the podium. Paralympic sport as itself has really struggled to gain the media attention that it rightfully deserves. And they didn't want their sporting moment to be taken away by something which is equally as important, but it's not the intent of all of the athletes on the podium, for example. So we held those conversations in October. There was 10 different focus groups that we held in English, French, and Spanish. And we took all of that feedback from those focus groups. And then from there, we then built a larger survey, which went out to the large athlete community, asking for feedback, asking for their thoughts on the various items for athlete expression at the games and what they would like to see moving forward from the IPC. Based on the outcomes from the focus group and also the outcomes of the survey, our Athletes Council then went and drafted the recommendations. They're recommendations, but they're more so, they're not recommended to anybody except for like the IPC governing board didn't have to approve them. It wasn't something that we had to go back to them for their feedback on. So it was a fully athlete-led consultation from start to finish. So we drafted our recommendations to be implemented within the IPC. Some were much more short-term recommendations that we knew we could do leading into Tokyo, both just capacity-wise to actually change things, but also realizing that we're in a COVID games for Tokyo and at least Beijing. So what does that mean for some of these activations that we would like to see for the future? We knew that some of these would have to be longer term solutions that would have to be worked on with the organizing committees, which couldn't be done a month before the games. So we had 8 recommendations that came out of our discussion. We really tried to balance the spectrum of feedback that we had. So protecting athletes on one end of the spectrum, but then also realizing that some athletes just want to be able to say whatever they want, whenever they want, and have the rule abolished. We knew that the solution of abolishing the rule would not end up being the route that we could go at this point in time. But we needed to open up new avenues because we realized that what we currently had in place was way too restrictive. So the first big one was the first outcome and recommendation was to continue to protect the field of play and official ceremonies. So that would be the podium for the most part, from allowing demonstrations to take place. The second one that we had was really about clarity on the existing rule that we have, which is Article 2.2 of the IPC handbook. At the moment, all of the information on freedom of expression is a little bit scattered. There's the rule, that's then the code of ethics, which you need to then bring together, which would then find some sort of sanction protocol. And there was no real place for athletes to go or for members of the Paralympic movement to go to learn about the rule, why it's in place, what is the process taken if there is a breach conducted. So we recommended to provide clarity to the existing article and update it. So that will be coming in the future. That's one that we need to work a lot closer on, and we're in the middle of a governance review. So that review will be approved this December at our General Assembly, and that will include pulling a lot of these various items for Article 2.2 together under one roof so that it's much more tangible and understandable for people to follow along with. One of the biggest outcomes and recommendations from the athletes was really to provide education. Athletes wanted to understand why the rule's in place, what they can do, what they can't do, what the process is for if they do something or their teammates do something, and then how they can be a better advocate for things that are aligned to the movement or aligned to their own personal things that are positive. So, avoiding hate speech, of course, would not fall into this. Another big one was really to develop a sanctions protocol for if there was a breach. Prior to Tokyo, we didn't have any kind of defined sanctions protocol in our code of ethics at the IPC. So leading into Tokyo, we've actually created a much more robust sanctions protocol if there's a breach. This includes an independent panel from the IPC, which will also always include at least one Paralympic athlete within the last 12 years of sport to be on this panel. The panel is usually 3 people. So if there's 2, right? But sometimes it'll only be one Paralympic athlete. And then, of course, defining the range of sanctions an athlete or an official at the games could receive if they were to breach the rules. So this is something that was implemented leading into Tokyo. And of course, we'll continue to revisit this piece to it as we experience having to go through the process. Another big one for us is we don't really have press conferences like the Olympics do after a competition and the medal ceremonies for athletes. We have the mix zone. We have, of course, we have media interviews. So we have to review the mix zone and media opportunities to give athletes more of an opportunity to be able to express themselves if they'd like. We really wanted to develop a space within the athletes' village that would give athletes an ability to be able to demonstrate regularly on various topics if they choose, whether it's in sort of the athlete plaza or somewhere else in the village. That could be like a daily or whatever it may look like, a live streaming space where athletes could have a voice to explore. But with COVID, it will of course be something a little bit more long-term like Paris. Increasing communications through the IPC channels was our second last recommendation about what it means to have a voice and how to be an effective voice for change on important topics for athletes. So really to show that the IPC is, of course, we want athletes to have a voice. We want them to be able to voice their opinions on things that matter to them. The communications for us it's not as simple as just putting information out to the community. It's also hosting different events. Can we host webinars where we bring in, experts within human rights and freedom of expression to be able to speak to the topic, not just to the athletes, but to our movement in general, and have these discussions so that everyone's a little bit more educated and they understand how to have an effective voice, so that when people choose to have a voice via the various avenues that are provided, they'll then be able to be effective in doing so and understand the rules that we have in place. And then, of course, the last one for us, prior to Tokyo, our social media guidelines were quite strict as far as the rules that where athletes could and couldn't do things. It did originally prohibit athletes from being able to use social media to express themselves, which I mean, when social media first started as a really big thing at games, I'd say about a decade ago, that may have been a little bit more understandable, applied to the time. But now, looking at how influential social media is and how much athletes engage on social media, we of course needed to update the social media guidelines to allow athletes to use their social media to express themselves however they'd wish during the games time. So those were also updated leading into Tokyo as well.
Amazing.
I guess the other big thing is from there, we will, of course, then review, what's working, what we need to update further. But that's for the Athletes Council to figure out.
I am just so impressed about the athletes asking for, education in that sense, because I think that's something that I really thought was missing from. I participated in the Olympic survey that was done that went out to Olympians. And there was just no context around it. And as someone who's like an expert in this, I was like pouring my context into the chat box I could, but there was really it was that missing thing. No one asked me if I wanted, information. So I have so many more questions for you, but I want to move on to Brendan as well. So, Brendan, last March, you were confirmed as the new chair of the Commonwealth Games Federation Athletes Advisory Council. So Commission, sorry. So congratulations on that. It's super exciting. So I know that you're also doing work on this topic at the Commonwealth Games Federation. How has the Athletes Commission approached the topic of freedom of expression? Is it similar to what they've been doing in the Paralympic movement, or tell us more about what you've been up to?
Thank you, Nikki. And it indeed was a pleasure to be appointed the chair of the Athletes Advisory Commission, especially coming from a small territory like the Commonwealth of Dominica. We are doing basically the exact same thing as the IPC. We have recognized that sport is more than just a competition. Sport is just the beginning. Sport connects us all in the aspiration of our dreams, our goals, for ourselves, our families, and our communities. But to ensure that all athletes are truly able to express themselves, the administrators, the sporting organizations must have the full backing. They must support these athletes and their aspirations and their dreams, because they are the ones who make the rules or govern the sporting movement. So the CGF, it well began before my appointment in March of this year. It began in 2018 when they instituted an Athletes Advisory Commission. This was the first commission enacted by the CGF. And in 2019, September 2019, we had a bilateral launch, the two entities, the Athletes Advisory Commission and the CGF, of the strategic plans. So the CGF had their Transformation 2022, while the Athletes Commission had their athlete strategy leading up to 2022. And both had the same mission, which was to be an athlete-centered, sport-focused Commonwealth sports movement with integrity, global impact, and embrace community as we deliver inspirational sporting moments, nurture a powerful sporting movement, activate transformational partnerships, and realize our collective impact. Now, this last point, realizing our collective impact, is a very crucial one to the athletes, as it focuses on athletes and sport for social change. Because we have athletes within the Commonwealth, who are impacted by a lot of social issues, such as racism, gender inequality, financial disparity. But who are the ones who need to speak up? It's the athletes themselves. We have recognized that athletes are the only key stakeholders in a sports system that are both the consumer and the producer of sports. So we must ensure that they have a safe space to express themselves, because they are both the reason for the existence of any sport entity. And yet they also require sport to be successful. So for us to freely express ourselves, there must be a collective partnership between the athletes and the administration. And this is what the Athletes Commission has been trying to do, to ensure that we work together with the administrators, with other stakeholders within sport, to ensure that we can bring forth our views, to ensure that we are able to compete in a safe space. Athletes go out and compete. It's not just the physical element, but the mental element, the psychological element, the health benefits. And if an athlete is able to express themselves within that space, they will perform at a higher level. But within the Commonwealth, we must ensure that the athletes do that in keeping with the values of the CGF movement, which is humanity, equality, and destiny. And if I expound on these values, humanity, we should all embrace Commonwealth athletes as citizens and communities and nations. Equality, we promote fairness, non-discrimination, and inclusion in all what we do, Commonwealth sport. Through impactful high-performance sports, we help Commonwealth athletes, citizens, and communities to realize their aspirations and ambitions. These aims are to empower and equip athletes as agents of change and advocates for integrity. It provides support and opportunities for CGAs to ensure that these athletes are able to do this, to contribute to truth, reconciliation, and relief programs, and to strengthen the contribution of sport of the Commonwealth in Commonwealth cities. The athletes, as of late since my appointment in March, we have been working on an athletes advocacy policy, which aims to allow athletes to freely express themselves within the games. We are trying to create a safe space within Commonwealth sport movement. And this safe space will allow athletes to advocate for issues, if I must say, to be that change within the movement. But with respect, we must all value the respect of our fellow athletes, the other stakeholders. For instance, if I was to advocate for an issue on the podium, I must respect the shared value for that podium of my other athlete. Because we've been working for 10 years, 5 years, 15 years to get to that point. So why would I steal that moment from another athlete? I should ensure that I have a conversation with the other athlete, that, hey, this is a cause that I am truly passionate about. As we saw in the advocate actions with Tommy Smith, with Peter Norman. They all were aware of the issues of racism, and they stood for a cause together. We threw away racial divide. We threw away which country we came from, but we came here to express ourselves with respect. This is the defining factor, with respect. We speak about human rights issues. We know what is freedom of expression, and it's governed by laws as well. There should not be inciting hate speech. So our aim as the CGF is to promote, to educate, and instill the empowerment through our athletes.
That's wonderful. Brendan, thank you so much for sharing. I mean, I think the one really interesting thing about the Commonwealth Games, having been to the Olympics and the Com Games, is, it's the friendly games. And so it really is a slightly different atmosphere. And I just loved how when we were talking last week and you said that, you should be having that conversation with the people that you're going to be on the podium with. And I just think, that's really lovely. I have questions for you as well, but what I might do is I might go to Gabby and then I might come back to you for your a few more as well. So FIF Pro represents 65,000 footballers, or as we call them, soccer players, around the world through affiliated national player associations. So in recent years, football, soccer players from different backgrounds There's so many activists in the football community, from Megan Rapinoe to Marcus Rashford, speaking out against discrimination, racial discrimination, gender discrimination, talking about different things like conditions in society. And, they're really being able to do that in a way that's a little different than what we would call like amateur athletes in the para and the Commonwealth Games movement, the Olympic movement. What has your experience been like as a professional football player on the topic of freedom of expression and activism?
Yeah, so my experience has been a bit interesting in that I think it's been a bit of a process. I grew up in the US. I played college soccer at Rice University, and I moved to Argentina quickly after graduating because my mom is from there, and thought I might have chances to play with the national team, and was going to get the opportunity to play with River Plate, which is in the men's game, a massive club which is well known around the world. But when I got there, I quickly saw that the conditions that the women were faced with were quite different from what I was used to as a Division I college athlete in the US. Things that I would consider basic to what you would need as a professional athlete, which would even be access to a pitch to train on, was something that we couldn't even take for granted. Sometimes we weren't even given that. And I think one of the things that sort of caught my attention was the fact that a lot of the players had sort of naturalized that mistreatment, that they thought it was something that they couldn't really speak out against because players in the past who had tried to do so were silenced or forced out of the club. Players didn't really have the opportunity to raise their voice or to speak up. And so a lot of players were willing to put up with those sort of conditions, and sometimes even put up with situations of abuse from coaches or administrators, because, well, it was either that or having to leave the game that they love. So I think for me, it was a bit of a shift in terms of seeing things from a different way, like coming from a society where I was, even in college sports, though, I think we mentioned it briefly before we actually got started, but you get used to following the rules. So sometimes it's really hard to question things in sport. It is an environment where the players who speak out sometimes are the ones who don't get to make it all the way because they don't conform enough to what we would call maybe sporting norms, which would be, the one who's probably most coachable, the one who is always early, does what the coach tells them to do, etc. So these sorts of conditions, I think I grew up in that, but never without the thought that, well, if something really were to happen, if I were to be mistreated, that I wouldn't be able to say something about it. But then coming to Argentina, I was faced with a different reality. But I think the wonderful thing that I was able to see is a transformation that occurred not only within the women's game, but also within the women's rights movement in general in Argentina and in Latin America. Really, the feminist movement started gaining a lot of ground in the last, I would say, 5-6 years or so. And I think that as female athletes, we were able to grab onto that and be part. And in 2017, actually, the Argentinian national team was able to organize its first strike ever in its history, because we were faced with, we weren't being paid our daily stipend, which was very minimal. I would say between $6 and $10 a day. We were being forced to train on a synthetic pitch when the association had like 10 grass pitches that were being used by the male teams. And then some pretty dismal conditions when we had to travel to play a friendly against Uruguay. And I think that was a really key moment, that even though there wasn't any sort of definite resolution of that, it was the first moment where you could see players coming together collectively and realizing that the power that they had was in the collective, and that's where they were protected, I think. Following that, we then went to what would be our World Cup qualifying competition, which is the Copa America, which was organized in early 2018. And Argentina hadn't qualified for the World Cup in 12 years heading into that moment. So for us, it was, I guess we sort of felt we had nothing to lose, but we'd had at that point a solid group of players that had been playing out of the country. So they'd started to see that what the conditions that we had in Argentina wasn't actually the only norm, like that there were possibilities for better conditions and real actual growth and to be taken seriously as professional athletes. And so we were in dialogue consistently with the federation during that time, like meetings the day before games. We'd have meetings with our with the president of women's football of AFA, which is our the Argentine Football Association, trying to fight for things that were even just like clothes that fit us, because the clothes that we were wearing were the hand-me-downs from the men that had been from like 3 or 4 previous cycles. Were what was left over. And so, but I think that whole process was sort of this kind of like consciousness raising, that we were realizing that change is possible, but we have to work together and we have to take a stand, not just for ourselves, but for generations to come. And it was really powerful to see, because like I'm an insider to a certain extent because I'm part of the team and I do consider myself Argentine, but having grown up in the States, I'm also sort of an outsider. But so seeing that change that really originated from the group almost organically was an amazing thing to be a part of. And that tournament, when we were really not getting the responses that we wanted to from the federation, we took a picture prior to playing against Colombia. We all put one hand behind our ear, asking to be heard, and every single player on the team posted it on our social media, and it was picked up very quickly by national media and then also international media. And like I said, I think the feminist movement had a big part in this, because I think if we had done that, I don't know, in the previous Copa America, which was in Ecuador, I think in 2014, I don't think we would have had the response that we did. I think the moment that we're living in now is really ripe for change. And I think that was a big part in having that demand sort of be heard. And yeah, I'd like to say that from then everything's gone great, but there have been some major steps that have been taken, I think, by the federation. They've started to take the women's national team a bit more seriously. In 2019, Argentina announced the professionalization of the women's league, which was a big step. It's got a long ways to go, but I think the fact that players are now protected by contracts, that's a big win for sure. And also the fact that players, now that they're contracted, they can also be represented by the player union in Argentina, which up till then only represented men. I think that was a big win as well. But yeah, I think the amazing thing about women's sport particularly, and I think of football especially, is that to a certain extent, you compete against other teams, right? But when you look across the field, you know that those players have their own struggles and they're also fighting for conditions that are maybe at a different stage in the battle than where you are. But there is this sense of sorority, I think, that is pretty amazing to see. And I think looking at perhaps even what's going on in the US with the latest round of abuse scandals that have come out in the National Women's Soccer League, there you're seeing the importance of solidarity and the player movement as well, and the importance of having a player association behind you who supports you and can help you really find that voice as well. I think that the right to freedom of expression and the right to organize are very, very closely connected. I think when you have the ability to fight as a collective and have a player association behind you that has the resources, like whether it's legal aid or player development, or just having someone that you can talk to if you have gone through a situation of abuse or anything like that, or mistreatment, I think that's really important. And I think that sort of maybe in the States what's been the catalyst for change, because I think that players they have tried to speak out against what had happened in the past, but weren't really ever listened to. And I think that real turning point is that the Player Association is beginning to gain traction, and they're starting to have their first attempts at their first ever collective bargaining agreement. So it's sort of a way to bridge that gap that occurs in the bit of a power imbalance that happens between sometimes the sporting federations or even clubs and institutions and the athletes, because in general, our careers are very precarious. They're uncertain. They can be very short, and obviously sometimes expressing yourself can be a risk of, like, you can risk your career immensely by putting yourself out there, especially if that means speaking out against your federation or even your club. So having that backing, I think, is really, really important.
And Gabby, I do want to come back to you in a second to learn a little bit more about your role on the Global Player Council. But you've touched upon my next question that I had for everybody, which is about this idea of collective action, because it is something that the center really is working on, right? Trying to, to make this change in the world of sport, we really need to have collective action. So Brendan and Chelsey, I'll start with Brendan. How are you going about sort of creating that collective action? I mean, we're, Commonwealth athletes, we're not unionized. So what are you doing to sort of take steps to create, to advance the dialogue on freedom of expression, but in a collective way?
We can do that by firstly recognizing that we do not live in a vacuum, that there are social issues being plaguing the athletes. And the majority of our athletes are plagued by social injustices, but only a minority seek to speak out. Only a minority seek to risk their careers, seek to go through the ramifications of being ostracized by their countries, their federations, and sporting movement. So since then, the Commonwealth Games Federation Athletes Advisory Commission have been in the developmental stage of preparing an athletes advocacy policy. This athlete advocacy policy is a first of its kind, where we went beyond just the athletes, but also seek consultation from other stakeholders, from former athletes, from legal minds, from individuals who are strong in human rights issues. Because activism or freedom of expression not only affects the athletes, but it affects all who are part and parcel of the sporting movement.
Wonderful. And Chelsey, how about you? How are you guys trying to get that collective action feeling, in the Paralympic community on this issue?
Yeah, it's such a loaded question to me, because there's such a span of perspectives globally about what human rights means from nation to nation, right? Yes, there's of course the definition that we all tend to follow, but in some nations that doesn't apply. So how do we bring everyone together collectively for a global understanding to be able to shift the dialogue and shift and move the dial on athlete expression? I think one of the really big things that really ties the Paralympic movement specifically to this item is the fact that everybody within the Paralympic movement, if you're an athlete, you have a disability. You're automatically, as somebody with a disability, you are part of the most marginalized group in the entire world. If we look at any population, any religion, any nationality, any group of people, any community of people, if you have a disability, you're automatically more marginalized than anybody else within that community. And that gives a new perspective to the idea of expression and athletes using their voice to shift the conversation about the disability agenda. The IPC recently launched a campaign called We the 15. It's the third pillar of our strategy for the IPC. So yes, we're a sporting organization, but how do we use sport to shift the dialogue for the inclusion agenda to really put disability at the heart of inclusion? There's 1.2 billion people in the world that have a disability. That's 15% of the population. Yet when we talk about inclusion and we talk about diversity, I'm always the one that's putting my hand up, continually saying, don't forget disability, because nobody thinks about them off the top of their head when they think about inclusion and they think about the things that need that, should be discussed on a large scale, or they need backing from the general public to be able to change the narrative of a conversation. So for me, I think that leaning on this new campaign we have, the 15% of the world that, has a disability, that is now going to shift the conversation of athlete expression, because we would love to use the Paralympic Games as a platform for athletes to be able to be ambassadors for this agenda item. But if they're going to be ambassadors for the disability agenda item, of course, they also need to be able to be ambassadors for any other agenda item that they see fit that is close to their hearts, whether it's race or religion, or support within their own nation, for example, for para sport. These things are going to shift the conversation. So the consultation that we've already had will continue to evolve because our movement is evolving quite quickly. And I think that once athletes begin to see the value in using their platform for good in this way, and they start seeing more structure around what that means, that if there is a breach of hate speech, how that will then be taken care of, or how we protect athletes, or how nations will protect athletes when they go home if they do say something. So yes, we agree with, LGBTQ rights, but some nations don't agree with that. So if an athlete were to get on the podium to be able and, protest in support of LGBTQ rights, yeah, the Paralympic movement is all about that. But what does that mean when they go home and we can't protect from that? So I think that the conversation is really going to be shifting. And I think that collective group of athletes are going to begin to start seeing how their voices do make impact. It was interesting because in our consultation, we even asked them, what if somebody was on the podium and they were advocating, they wanted to do a demonstration about disability inclusion? And it was really shocking to hear fellow para athletes say, nope, they can't do that. Just because, it's a common thing for all of us, it's still taking away my sporting moment. So hopefully through We the 15 and through this new strategic pillar for the IPC, we'll be able to use this opportunity over the next, it's not going to happen in the next year, but over the next decade to really shift the conversation. And more athletes will hopefully be willing and wanting to step forward and be an advocate for not just this topic, but other topics as well. But I think that there is a Paralympic athletes and para athletes, I wouldn't say all of them. I think a lot of athletes, when you have a disability, you tend to just want to fit in with everybody, and you tend to just want to be seen for your accomplishments. And athletes with disabilities that I've spoken to say, well, I don't really want to step outside of, sport, because I already have a disability. I already stick out enough as it is. I don't want to stick out even more. So how do we balance that by giving them, the ability to be able to have a voice and to know they have the support behind them, while also and empowering them to do so with the proper education to do it in an effective way, and move the movement forward on the disability agenda and all the other agendas that we're about, which is really inclusion.
Amazing. Well, we've sort of moved already into potential question time. I have some questions that are still lingering in my mind. There's already some questions coming in through the chat, so I'm going to just start to, throw them out there. Chelsey, really quickly, somebody has asked if the recommendations that you talked about earlier, are those publicly available, or are those things that were just private?
They are publicly available. We launched them in, I think, the end of June or maybe early July of this year. They're on the IPC website. If you just look up IPC Athletes Council Rule 50 recommendations or something like that.
Okay. And my follow-up question to that was one of the things that you talked about, which was really dear to my heart as a lawyer, was that you were talking about protocols for how breaches could be reviewed. Did the protocols or anything that you recommended get used in Tokyo?
Yes. So the protocol process is fully operational. There were a few breaches in Tokyo that are still they're under review right now. So the panels are now reviewing all the information to figure out what the sanction could be, if there will be a sanction for the few breaches that were had.
Okay, very interesting. Follow this space. That will be really interesting to see how that unfolds, especially as we move into Beijing, which I think is will have a very different tone than Tokyo.
Very much.
Brendan, you mentioned also the policy that you're working on, which is much more robust. I mean, I really like the idea that it's not just about freedom of expression; it's also about a whole advocacy policy. When are we going to get to see that? What is the due date?
All right, it's pretty much complete. So we are trying to launch it by the beginning of January, but it's basically to be enacted before Birmingham 2022. So we, as the Commonwealth Games Athletes Advisory Commission, will go on a drive to educate our athletes, because this would be the most crucial aspect of the policy. If you implement a policy or you present a policy without educating the athletes, they may not know their rights. They may not know the guiding principles, to basically allow them to express themselves, allow them to be their person, allow them to compete in a safe space within the Commonwealth sport movement. Because like Chelsey and Gabby indicated, that we are plagued with several issues. It could be from a team level to disability to the constant bombardment of social issues that we, the athletes, are faced with. So we need to educate our athletes as to how can they go out there and express themselves. Because we know freedom of expression is a contentious issue, where though in one aspect you're saying that you have the right to freely and openly say what you can, but you are governed by regulations, laws, and other enactments which may deter you from doing that. You may also be faced with, loss of income, sideballed by your federations. So it's all about presenting this document by January leading up to Birmingham 2022, and then educating our athletes.
Right. So Gabby, I wanted to get back to you a little bit about, because I didn't know about this, and I thought it was really interesting learning that FIFPro has a global player council. Can you tell us about what you do as part of that, about that role?
Sure. So the Global Player Council, I think, is an initiative that started in 2019, initially with the men, and then at the World Cup in 2019, FIFPro started to reach out to female players as well. And I think essentially the most important part of the Global Player Council is not necessarily that we're not, I wouldn't say we're athlete representatives. I wouldn't consider myself representative of every athlete or every player in Argentina or at whatever club I am now. I think what it does do for FIFPro is it brings a connection directly to the athlete, and it also has brought us into spaces where we're interacting and with global organizations, including sitting at the table with FIFA and negotiations. And I think that's really important, is getting those organizations also hearing the voice of the athlete, what's actually happening on the ground. And then also serving as a point of contact for things that might be beyond the control of local unions. I think in Argentina, for example, this year, a group of players filed a sexual abuse and harassment complaint against a coach that was under the employment of the National Federation. And FIFPro has been the one that's been giving the legal support in that and has brought it to FIFA and made sure that the athletes are protected, like they've done for the group of players from Afghanistan as well, who brought forth the case, I think it was in 2018, and then also have been supporting the players from another massive abuse scandal in Haiti. So I think it's a balance between sort of what we as athletes can give to FIFPro, and then also FIFPro getting closer to the athletes that their national federation or national unions are also working with. It's a really amazing initiative, and I think one of the things that I've most enjoyed about it as well is when we've been able to come together as a group of athletes and listen to each other's experiences, because what I've gone through in Argentina is quite different from, say, Elise Kellon Knight with the Matildas in Australia and what they've been able to accomplish through collective bargaining and in conjunction with the union here in Australia, which is very strong and very player driven, including, so they've actually been one of the first national teams, female national league teams, to really reach legitimate pay equality with the men's national team, and that's been an accomplishment don't think anyone's been able to equal so far. Hopefully other national teams will follow suit. And then hearing sometimes from some of the English players as well, who might have experienced forms of racism that might be different to what goes on in Argentina too. So just being able to share experiences and understand sort of the struggles that each of us go through in our different contexts, and having a bit of empathy as well on that. It's been a really cool initiative, and I think it'll be something that will only continue to grow in the future.
That's so great. And you touched a little bit on how the success that the Matildas, the soccer team here in Australia has had, and that they did have a lot of support from the men's team. And I think one thing I would love to hear anyone's thoughts on, how do we all work together, right? We all have our little spaces and our sports and our, but really what if we were to reach out as a collective across, our groups? I know it's really hard, but I think the three of you have so much experience and knowledge about what you're doing in your own worlds. Imagine if we reach out our hand, to the Paralympians and the Paralympians, to us with the knowledge, because I feel like we need to all be coming together and sharing all the things that we've been learning over the last few years. If anyone has thoughts on that.
I think that's really beneficial. I think that there's no need to recreate the wheel when it comes to doing some of this work. Of course, every organization will have their unique needs that they need to address that makes it specific to their community. But I think there's definitely no harm in trying to work together across the various organizations to have lessons learned and things that maybe one organization is doing that another one may not have thought of doing, things that work, things that don't work. I think that would all be really beneficial to do. And I know that we'd definitely be open to hearing more about what other organizations are doing outside of the IOC in this space, since we've already worked with the IOC.
Wonderful. And Brendan?
Yeah, well, the Center of Sport and Human Rights have proven to be the catalyst already by just bringing us together within this forum, because we as leaders within our own sporting associations, organizations, have proven to be that we know what we're doing, but there's so much we can learn from each other. We need to break from this bubble and come together and bring collective ideas. So far, the Center for Sport and Human Rights have been doing an excellent job. And if we come together, the three of us, it may be a beginning for the evolution of the freedom of expression of athletes globally.
Wonderful. Now, one last sort of series of questions that came in, and we have about probably 6 minutes, so maybe 2 minutes from each of you, just on the idea really of how, how can national associations and other sporting bodies, so not necessarily the CGF or the IPC or FIFA, but even sort of lower down, when we talk about national sports governing bodies, how can they support athlete activism and provide sort of more clarity on some of these issues? Maybe Chelsey, do you want to start?
Sure. I think the first big thing, which is across the board, would really be for national organizations to utilize their connections to their network of athletes to educate them. That's number one. And educate them not just on their national law, because everyone's different, but educate them on the global scope of what it looks like to have a voice. We heard from athletes from the US, for example, that were, of course, rightfully so, had one very specific agenda, but they weren't considering the whole world. So how do we ensure that when athletes are educated nationally, they understand the repercussions for everybody aren't going to be the same as the repercussions in your nation, which might be nothing, that you have the right to express yourself freely. So I think that would be the really big one. But I think also it would be really great for national organizations, national governing bodies of sports to set their own guidelines for what this means for their athletes, whether it's taking more of an approach of what does inclusivity mean for your organization? What does it mean to have a voice? What do you support as an organization? And what does your athletes committee or your athletes council support on behalf of their athlete community? And then put those guidelines to paper. Give your athletes something that they can see that's tangible to understand what is being supported within your own organization, what the athletes can and can't do. The USOPC took a really strong stance about social justice and allowing their athletes to be able to use their space at their Olympic and Paralympic trials and at the Olympic and Paralympic Games without having to worry about repercussions when they come home. what will other organizations do to start allowing their athletes to have more of a voice and to feel like some of the things that Gabby may have spoken about earlier, as far as awareness or being able to speak up on important topics without repercussions. Athletes need to understand that, and they need to understand where they fall in the space, and then give them the platform to be able to define what that means to them as well.
Wonderful. Brendan, do you have a 1-minute answer?
Well, to be honest, I'll be the devil advocate on this one, where I represent the majority. And when I state I represent the majority, I represent a lot of the national associations who don't empower their athletes. They restrict their athletes. So we, as the different stakeholders in the IPC, IOC, FIBPro, CGF, we need to educate these NOCs or these national associations so that they can go back to educate their athletes. Because we have NOCs within the Caribbean, within Africa, within Oceania, who looks at it as a negative connotation when an athlete expresses themselves. Mm-hmm. They don't set any guidelines. Is that you go out there, you compete, and you come back home. By you taking a stand will bring disrepute to the country, the NOC, the national associations. So before these national associations go out to educate the athletes, they must be empowered by the major sporting organizations. Then we can have our athletes who are truly, advocates for change within their sporting spectrum.
Thank you, Brendan. And Gabby, you get the last word.
Well, that's a lot of pressure. No, I think that obviously individual and perhaps team sports might be different, but I think in those spaces where you have players that already are unionized and they do have player associations, I think it's really important to engage with those player associations in order to, yes, develop a sort of framework, whether it's a human rights framework that says, well, how are we going to handle issues of athlete expression? But I think it's really important that decisions that affect players directly and that rule and regulate their practice as athletes and their profession, that those decisions are not made just based on what a sport governing body thinks is best for the athlete or for the sport itself, but really listening to the voices of the athletes to where, yes, they're not fearing repercussions, they're not fearing retaliation, they're not fearing those things that Brendan was mentioning, what Chelsey was mentioning as well, to where players and federations and player associations can work all together to create a better sport. I think that's the end goal, where we might all have different sort of viewpoints on it, but I think that going forward collectively is the best way to do so.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute pleasure. And given that Mary Harvey, our CEO here at the center, is a fellow, goalkeeper extraordinaire to you, Gabby, I have a feeling that this is a conversation that we will be able to keep having here at the center under Mary's leadership. So next up, we're looking forward to seeing you all at the next live session at 4 p.m. CET time, which is 1 a.m. here in Australia. So I will probably be catching it on video. It is the essentials for broadcasters and journalists in high-risk sport contexts, which will outline why press freedom in sports reporting is so important, what constitutes high-risk areas, and what the risks are for everyone. And for the various parts of the media working in these environments. So that sounds like an awesome panel. I almost want to stay awake for it. I hope you will all join us. And thank you again to Gabby, Brendan, and Chelsey. It really has been a lovely panel. And I look forward to staying in touch. Thank you, everyone.